Hello everyone, today we talk briefly about the English peasantry autonomy during the 12th, 13th century, and High Middle Ages, and observing it in a comparative fashion, especially with other European regions. And England is a very interesting country in this regard because it's factually the most developed of Northern European ones at this point. And Northern Europe took a while before taking off in terms of demographical economical expansion in comparable ways to other areas, especially of the continent. England is the one that in fact goes further like that, and there are broader reasons for this. In general, the country had been, since the Iron Age, exposed to very intense contact with continental civilizations. Had been conquered. It was factually, as you know, in essentially a Celtic area, part of the broader trade network of the Belgian mostly. Oppida that were already developed in the south of Britain by the time of the Roman conquest. Britain was a Roman client state where before the actual occupation, it served its purpose in this regard, as it was eventually kept by the Romans for centuries. This provided the country with a urbanization, with some important infrastructural presence. It was, wherever the Roman expanded, it's because, the local resources could support the specific political and social and military organization of the empire that, was part of this much broader, in fact, universal domination that brought an important amount of development to the conquered lands. The Anglo-Saxons had eventually infiltrated in the country, and managing to establish the sub-kingdoms that Britain in this sense was one of the least, in broader terms, Romanized lands, right? So differently from countries like Gaul, Spain, Italy, etc., there was not quite in Britain like the same subtle development that had characterized the continent, but at the same time, there was something evolving in very peculiar fashion, and albeit more slowly, but still very, very intense, let's say, compactly, and with a degree of of also political and institutional refinement that had brought eventually to this idea of the Kingdom of England that encompassed the previous smaller powers that had come together in that sense, as both mostly also because of external pressure. Think about the Viking invasions that eventually kept left an important mark, especially in the east of the island, so much that by the time of the Norman conquest, we talk of not much of an Anglo-Saxon, but of an Anglo-Danish reality. And this world had developed by the 11th century some of the most advanced administrative structures in the West, and it was characteristically based, because of the previous parcellization and the less stratification of the community compared to the continent. It was essentially already a feudal reality. An important, maybe calling it public, it was too much, but I mean this sense of the commonality, right? Properly, this stands at the root of the same common law. The idea that it was still the law of a people, the Anglo-Saxon one, that had fundamentally that pre-existed and the same state. And this is in historical perspective, of course, true, because that's exactly how the Anglo-Saxon power, the English kingdom had emerged as such, from these sub-powers coming together, one on another, and therefore had maintained an important, given the broader development of the country was again very well connected, especially to any influenced by Frankish power, talking about especially the southeast. Of course, the Midlands were not quite the same thing. The western part, essentially still Celtic lands were, something else. That Scotland and Ireland were much less, developed than England since ever at that point. And therefore, at the time of the Norman conquest, the Normans, William the Conqueror's descendants, were quite clever and capable to exploit this pre-existing political and administrative base. It was based on, in fact, on an important degree of autonomy of freemen, right? That actually the Norman conquest brought down dramatically, because the Norman conquest of England is one of the single most radically brutal and violent chapters in the history of the world, medieval Europe. Not much even just for the conquest in itself, but for all the Anglo-Saxon resistance that emerged, like in this following generation, it was curbed without any kind of possible conceivable mercy. There was naturally some negotiation where, of course, some Anglo-Saxon elements could be co-opted and cooperated since the beginning. I mean, the system collapsed for a number of reasons that we will express in another we'll explain in another video. This less stratification is not of the community is not necessarily a positive thing per se, right? It's just it brings in it favors the idea of a more public culture in a way, which in this land, was not much statal in nature, and again, that's what influenced the common law and other developments. But it's like, there were some peoples that were better at war in a sense, and the Frankish main continent was at that point more advanced, right? The Frankish culture had always been fundamentally about warfare and had developed this quite, in fact, hierarchized vassalitic beneficiary system that could produce this outstanding and truly professional military elite that fundamentally wouldn't exist as such, so structurally, so homogeneously, like in other countries. When you look at what the Franks had expanded in, in fact, the same Anglo-Saxons, the Slavs, the Longobards, these were all peoples that had essentially different degrees of civil development, right? But that had in common, a more equal distribution of wealth, for which they, at least especially in the most developed areas in Southern Europe, were fundamentally bringing an important public culture to the fore, because these were, more urbanized, literate, per capita wealth rich lands, right, that hadn't produced and that could exist because there was no elite that had privately taken over everything, like in the Frankish world. So the Anglo-Saxon reality was by that point kind of in between, meaning that the future towards the 11th century all over Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East was tendentially feudal, right? At least all these powers underwent a degree of privatization that was evident to previous times. The Anglo-Danish were something more similar like that too. Think about the various kings of England, the Huscarls, all these private military retinue. The same Firth had somewhat declined in importance compared to previous times. The Firth was the sense that the levy, right? The country military levy that reflected in this sense a connection with the land. These were all the Anglo-Saxon landowners that were all, it was as a privilege and a duty, so as a right and a duty to participate to the army, right? That gradually had been eroded because even in England, of course, things had went hierarchizing gradually. Right, the Anglo-Danish connection, there is also an Anglo-Norman connection already, right? England was somewhat Anglo-Norman already before the Norman invasion. It's important to distinguish in this sense the divide between, countries like Denmark or Norway and the Duchy of Normandy and the broader Western Frankish reality, because those were quite different things, right? People like to stress the ethnic side of the story, but the truth is that from a political and social point of view, there was something completely different, right? Scandinavia was a bit like England itself. It was less stratified in character. Western Francia was fundamentally dramatically stratified, and there were two really very that was a feudal country, right? There's no way to put it otherwise. So the Norman conquest of England brought to this very heavy and successful, as brutal as we're saying, political and social engineering, for which a new monarchy was established that, albeit maintaining certain administrative Anglo-Saxon administrative practices, was fundamentally a feudal one, right? Where some lords that owned all the land fundamentally, and the freemen were in this sense ever more eroded in their autonomy, marginated, brought under the control properly of the barons in the manorial system, and it was effectively also a military occupation, as you understand. It was all the encastillation phenomenon, which great part of Norman. There are huge historiographical debates on whether this had already started before, things like these. But it's obvious that whichever the trend was, which was surely towards privatization, the Normans dramatically catalyzed and accelerated it, and established a very firm control on what they considered factually their own personal possession. Right? It was a very Frankish way of reasoning that was due to the fact that this land fundamentally was, albeit Christian, conquered on behalf of the Pope, at least with the permission of the papacy. It was conquered from. It had not been part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? It was, if you want, an extraneous land. If the Normans had failed in 1066, England would have probably gone on it as a more of a properly much more Scandinavian-like country in some ways than being effectively incorporated to what properly we see as Western Europe strictly meant. And that was really another thing. And this process naturally, as you understand, brought down the peasant, related to the freemen in general, so they were ever more subjugated to baronial rule, right, in the manors, etc. And this was largely, England had its own cities that were, especially in administrative terms, much more important than they were, for example, in the continent, in a way. The Kingdom of England had, in London, for example, also as a chancellor, etc., a capital, much earlier than France had Paris as a fixed one, right? So this is part of that kind of public culture, if you want. It's a bit more forced because, of course, England is also a more compact country, right? It's smaller, it's well, geographically, defined and outlined, and its boundaries that are essentially the sea, and in certain areas within the same Britain that are, consistently different from the peoples and the environments that had it, and that have always marked a bit the boundaries since Celtic or Roman times of what was kind of within the civilized world and what was outside, right? And the Normans installed themselves effectively into this, in the wake of this development that had gone on and gradually during the Anglo-Saxon period. This for saying that yes, there were cities, important centers, etc., but factually, and also how it would evolve later on as an important centralized kingdom for medieval standards, essentially London and nothing else, right? Maybe it's too radical, especially for the Middle Ages, but factually London, yes, was the by scale the most important center, and would always be more, gradually swallowing. And this is a broader process in modern history. Eventually, just look at the most, like in France, right? It was full of cities. It's just, if you look today, basically the only great cities aside from Paris are effectively Lyon and Marseille, that are also in the south, in in an hour. So the same go with England, that effectively is today still London fundamentally, and yes, something else, of course, in the northwest in terms of properly it's a very densely populated countries, because of the wealth, because of the old industrialization, the order, this quite compact development that England had since this times, fundamentally, since even Anglo-Saxon times, as a unitary reality, which is rare historically. Like if you look at the history of continental Europe, it's not so obvious, right? Where does France and Germany end and Germany begins, right? This is not entirely clear. You could make the same argument for, I don't know, Norman Scotland at some point. Now there was an important penetration from from England, from etc. But fundamentally, there is an easier space where you can enucleate the country in itself, and as a consequence, it was largely the cities. You see, I talk about these because we're not talking about communal freedoms in England. There was some communal realities that had their own degree of autonomies, but there's nothing like, I don't know, city-state, as we could mean for other areas of Europe. The peasantry, it's an overwhelmingly rural country, right? And so the peasantry is, of course, the base of labor force, as in any other country this time, but in England it has even a more important dimension. And the peasantry, as we've seen in Anglo-Saxon times, had used to live freer than, I don't know, say France, right? So the Norman domination changed that, as we've seen, quite drastically. And the peasant resistance that kept existing, right, in a longer perspective, in a longer run, were solicited fundamentally by the reorganization, largely, of the landed seigneury, the manor, right? That especially from the last years of the 12th century, so the re-evaluation of the Dominicum, of the Dominus Reserve, let's say, and the institution of intendants that had to take care of the seigneurial interests and direct the agricultural operations on the Dominicum. So this corresponds to an intensification, essentially, of the manor's control over the surrounding communities, because the seigneuries become ever more entrenched in their own territory. This is in the 12th century, is also the gradual shift towards the typically moat and bailey castle to some of this bulkier stone fortifications that correspond properly to the enrichment itself of the same lords, and naturally with this consolidation that is naturally in favor of the feudal system, the peasantry are gradually brought and within the manor in essentially a servile condition, right? That subtracting them to royal protection and bringing them under the manorial justice, so a private one essentially, contributed to reinforce the power of the dominus and to increase the seigneurial income further. This is a particularly important phenomenon because, you see, when the Normans invaded England, of course, as we were saying before, there was properly the continuation of an orderly, it was like a country built where you had seized, you had grabbed, you had conquered, invaded, and controlled. Now, without anybody telling you essentially what you could do in there, because the Normans were now the kings of England, right? In France, they were just the dukes of Normandy. They could literally do whatever they wanted, right? And it's exactly what the mentality, the root Frankish mentality was about. The Western Frankish kings at that point would have liked to have really the entirety of France to dispose, like the Dukes of Normandy disposed of their own kingdom of England, right? And it was all the more advantageous for the Normans because, as we were saying before, not only this country was fundamentally had lived at the margins of the broader, political and institutional developments of the empire, etc., across the channel. It was literally another world, right? But it was not a feudal one, in spite of that, the aforementioned clientelar privatization that the Anglo-Saxon world had undergone, especially after the time, the Viking penetration, the Danish domination, and so on. So this was a dream come true for the Normans. We've seen it recently. We made that video also about the Kingdom of Sicily. The Norman conquests of England and Sicily are a big deal in the history of Europe because they were essentially lands where feudalism would not exist, and therefore where we can see what a power, albeit feudal in nature in itself, could essentially reorganize, not literally from scratch, because in both countries it was a progressive administration, was actually profitably brought under the same normal control, but fundamentally to create a balance artificially, so not historically sedimented like you could find at that point in countries like France, like Germany, etc., that could fix the political institutional boundaries to maintain the same balance, right? That is to say, creating a country where especially the power of the nobility, of the barons, had to be counterbalanced by the rights of the pre-existing communities, right? So that you could, as a king, fundamentally play on this or that other subject to maintain your own power, right? A functional control of the kingdom without being choked by the nobility, like in France, that at this point, the kings controlled just the Ile-de-France, and all the rest was, as the same Normans proved, completely, not completely, but de facto autonomous, if not independent, especially in very far away areas from the north. So, the Norman conquests of England and Sicily would bring to the creation of the most centralized kingdoms in Latin Germanic Europe, right? By Western standards, they were not as much as the Byzantines and about the Muslims of Spain, that, however, as we were saying before, also were undergoing their own degree of privatization and collapse, if you want, of that hardcore public statal authority of Roman, essentially of Roman model, and this manorial expansion in 12th century England corresponds, as you understand, not just to a loss in autonomy of the peasantry, but as a consequence also of a loss of autonomy of the monarchy in itself, because the more the barons expand their power, and the more the king has problems to control them, right? And as we just said, the protection that the monarchy had extended over the peasantry at this point was being eroded by private power. And this is a very common problem everywhere, right? Independently from these different degrees of privatization, because that's something you want to avoid as a public authority, right? And the 12th century, as you know, is a moment of great growth, so it's difficult in a pre-industrial reality with ridiculous coercive means to stop this phenomenon, right? What could you do effectively against these barons, right? First of all, they would be kind of solidal with each other, right? So if you, think about later on the Magna Carta in general, the various constitutions that were, emanated on its wake, and so it was the barons, right? And also some of the most power. So properly, somebody was enucleating itself as the lords, meant as something corporative in themselves. So you could maybe try to put some pressure even to. There were as you know, civil wars in these centuries. It was not tremendously peaceful moment for England, but it was objectively impossible to stem a broader political and social phenomenon like the loss in power of the peasantry and the consequent extension of manorial power at the same time. So the peasantry in itself began to protest in this regard, and as you understand here, already the tone of the debate is relatively low by certain standards, because what the lords are doing is reinforcing their own income by essentially investing some resources in the creation of these administrators, provided also with some, of course, coercive power to exact tolls, etc., to bring, especially that could direct here the agricultural work in directions that would be ever more on a much larger scale, if you want, even in a more rational sense, because we know that feudalism is effectively the same system that brought to the expansion of these economies in exactly in these centuries, like the 12th especially is becoming to boom, right, for medieval standards, from pre-industrial standards. In a way, England had an important growth. Northern Europe in general had, in these times, in relative terms, a greater growth than Southern Europe. Doesn't matter that, of course, it was still less productive, but if you look at especially certain English areas, you realize that also in Germany it was a very fast growth compared to the average, right? Because these were all lands that finally had a new control from the top, as they never quite had before. So there was an added value to this broader rationalization. So it's not all bad, naturally, but this was surely exploiting the peasantry and bringing more pressure on them, and that they would disagree with. Always remember that the peasantry in the Middle Ages is not really the guy who just is enslaved to work the land all the time, that can't do anything about it because it's too poor, right? But in this time, especially in a country like England, I would say comparatively to other more used to feudalism, the peasantry had its own degree of strength, of power, right? The peasantry has been always some of the most ferociously violent and properly cruel and evil, I would say, component element. The lowest class has always been, right? There's blind rage sometimes, and not, think about the Jacquerie of this almost, they were objectively brought to that, right? It was either that or starving to death, so there wasn't much they could do, but they would lack a broader organizational capacity. They lacked the cultural, the intellectual tools, the awareness of their condition. They were also very locally minded, like they wouldn't have a broader understanding of the outer world more than much. But the great and true oppression of the peasantry, something you see more consistently, way more in the modern age, in the later Middle Ages, right? In the High Middle Ages, the peasantry was relatively free, and what we see here as this resistance is still, the proof that autonomy and that force still existed, but it's still not in the English case specifically a particularly impacting force, because of the very hard structure given by the monarchy and by the nobility to their own landed power. And so especially from the mid-13th century, so the moment essentially of peak of medieval civilization, so the moment in which also it was the peak of feudalism in a way, but in parallel had witnessed also a dramatic development of the lowest classes, right? Here this peak of feudalism, but it's also the peak in other areas of the communes, in part also this peasantry, especially in a country again like England, where the city-state wouldn't quite be there. So these were literally the broader commoners concretely meant. So from this moment onwards, there are many, there are many examples of collective resistance that is expressed in the refusal of paying the head money or to carry out services on the Dominicum, so on the manorial, properly on the master, on the lord's land, private possession, and in the, in the turning to royal tribunals to protest against the seigneurial abuses, right? And the royal tribunals were exactly there, especially in a country like England that had provided with this important royal presence on the territory since the beginning, exactly to check that, at least to contain, to stamp that baronial expansion. An important tool, right? That could say, okay, if you are our king, that these noblemen are abusing of our freedom, essentially our freedoms, and therefore you have to intervene, right? And the judgments of such tribunals assume a similar value to the charters that also in other contexts fixed the customs and the norms that regulated the relations between lords and peasants, right? And the English rural communities, however, were autonomous limitedly, or in general, to questions, as we were saying before, concerning just the discipline of the agricultural activities, right? So when you read that, you understand that if all they could do was just complaining about what kind of production regime they had to be brought under, while basically agreeing of the fact that they were still rigidly inserted within the seigneurial system, well, this doesn't surely reflect a particularly advantageous ratio of strength on the side of the peasantry, right? So in fact, even when there are conflicts within lords and peasants, the presence of a royal apparatus of power still limited drastically the possibilities of autonomous organization of the collectivity, right? It is true that the monarchy was in every country more or less more sympathetic to the common people than to the nobility, because the nobility would be always the main threat, right? So, but this has nothing to do, especially in a medieval context, in a feudal context, with the sympathy that the kings would have had towards the peasantry if the nobility had not existed, right? Always remember that in medieval times peasants by noblemen were considered barely as human beings, right? So meaning often they literally believed they were half animals. They had some kind of proto-racial or kind of biological inferiority of some sort, right? They were properly considered like, in fact, barely human beings, quasi-animals in a way. And of course, the kings were made of the same paste of all the rest of the nobility, that in part, was definitely more ferocious than the kings themselves, that in practice, given the dynastic continuities and or the habit to exercise of power from the top, they were generally more intelligent than the rest of the nobility, of the little baron, I don't know, on the Welsh frontier that just cared to carve its own seigneury and not even a damn about the kingdom or anybody else for that matter. But it is obvious in this regard that, in fact, whenever if the English peasants had any kind of chance to emancipate themselves from this or that lord at a local level, as soon as they finally came out, there was still royal power that said, wait a second, this is still royal business in a way. So you are brought also within from our side rather than these other guys, but you really do not go anywhere, right? And I think it was important to premise that England in this sense was the most developed country in Northern Europe, because if this was the case, you realize how the rest, the reality was concretely in other countries. Actually, in terms of not much actually of power, of let's say of the actual autonomies that were provided, but of actual power, meaning that, for example, if you look at Scandinavia, you see that even there was a much lower potential, growth potential in general, right? So the monarchy took really a long time to form itself, right? It's just by the late Middle Ages that you have some kind of state you can start talking about consistently. So in that situation, for example, certain, Scandinavia didn't have cities as we concretely mean them, right? By Roman, like London was a city, as we were saying before, right? In Scandinavia, there was no equivalent to that. There were some more important centers, but they were more like towns, right? They were also more, say, their value in the broader political institutional balance was more fluctuating. So the certain village communities, I don't know, in the Swedish hinterland or this areas that were even properly difficult to reach from the monarchy, would be granted, for example, some charters, certain autonomies to say, okay, you have town rights, right? Town rights would practically meant at that point that there was no town. Factually, there were just a bunch of villages that were fighting against each other and that wanted to get the support of the king against one or the other community of villagers and to boast in those rights. But the power, let's say, of a peasant, autonomization to grow into something else, right? Into something more developed, articulated, to found, for example, towns on their own. They could even develop into cities at some point. Wasn't quite there, right? Maybe the peasantry was freer, but the living conditions were dramatically lower compared to, I don't know, even to the English peasantry in that regard, right? Because England was still an importantly productive country, as we were saying before, and but yet in terms of central power, it had much more rigid and drastic authorities that would prevent at that point any kind of this peasant development to be still framed within its own control, right? So this is an important picture to stress, because it's not that everywhere, the freer you are, the better you live. This is absolutely, history proves you wrong all the time, because England, and this is the comparative nature of it, yes, it's the brightest example in this sense in Northern Europe. It's not that in Scotland or in Ireland people lived better because they had a freer, the average commoner was freer, right? In a civilization, you have to be properly part of a system that is able to project further. As a power, England would go on dramatically well, especially up to the 14th to 15th century. It reached certain levels of political institutional development that literally saved the country actually from destruction, right? If during the 100 Years' War, England had not had its own already, important unity, institutional culture, political cohesion, right? Any defeat at the hands of the French in major battles like Crécy, Poitiers, the same Azincourt, would have made the country collapse, right? So I would say even the final loss of the war brought, in a sense, to that kind of shrinking of English power that only gradually reacquired that importance, fully in an updated way by Western standards by the 17th century, right? So these are important because at this point, of course, the English retained their own French domains. They used them in it was not quite a colonial fashion at all, but of course there would be a gradual also detachment from the mainland in terms of allegiance, of identities, and so on. But it was still a very important power in Europe, right? And which, based on a country like this, that, as we were saying before, is not particularly large, it's not particularly productive, but still it has an order in itself, right? That manages to to even interfere successfully, but with a much larger system like the French one, and to make it bleed at some point. And this would have not been possible without a sounder control on the communities. And that's the same reason as you were saying before, why, for example, in Scandinavia, those kingdoms wouldn't quite achieve quite the same thing. So there are other European comparative examples we can make. For example, some areas of Upper Bavaria, right, where the great landed seigniories up to the 12th century had framed the rural populations in political, institutional, let's say, enough rigid and safe political institutional structures. Well, the peasant communities wouldn't manage to develop their own autonomies, right? Because they would always be brought under that kind of more lordly power that, especially in that case, was completely, almost completely uncontrolled, right? As Germany was yet another thing. Like Germany was instead the tribute of privatization. Maybe not just by the 12th century, but still, what all the problems of the German kingdom was. It was effectively an elective monarchy, and still you couldn't basically dislodge many of the lords from their own possessions. And even there, in fact, whatever the peasantry effectively would achieve, right, was quite difficultly part of the broader balance. I mean, surely in the 13th century, especially in the most developed German areas, there was an important peasantry development comparison. Even we see it in military history. Think about the Battle of Waringen, that was so crucial to bring the same Archbishop of Cologne down. Made a video about that in the government of Cologne. Well, that is a force you have to reckon, right? So, but that's the same moment where those guys could go arms in hands on a battlefield to do that. In England, they were just asking, to fix the kind of agricultural regime they were under, right? So that gives you the dimension of how different the thing was. And again, it's not necessarily for that country, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like Germany would remain like that up to the 19th century. The British had an empire on their own, and that has a lot to do with how, in fact, institutionally, the Kingdom of England had developed in fact, in this broader historical perspective, right? And aside from the much wider-ranging consideration, the futures of the respective countries, there is yet, however, another thing last thing to observe about the dynamic that we have highlighted, that is still fact that the English monarchy would have a limited, if you want, interference through this peasant resistance, let's say, or complaints, denounces, and so on, to on the manorial economy. That is to say, some of peasant prerogatives were recognized by royal charters, so that's quite important. But still, they were again about what were the work regime under which they had to provide certain services, and the corvée were there. The thing was still evidently in favor of a role in the balance to the barons, right? But still, the monarchy at that point could step in and say, still, those are English subjects, and we have the duty to defend their own prerogatives, and at least, less ideally, more pragmatically, have our own thing, our own say in this kind of say negotiations, I call it in this way, about the agricultural production organization. And that was yet another way for the monarchy to still, influence the baronial control. But today's video is not about this, as you understand it. There were much more intense and much, more disruptive scalar dynamics in the relation there between the king and the barons at some levels throughout all this time that make this fairly relative. But still, this is important because it reveals the presence of the monarchy in the system, and therefore the institutional value that still the peasant community resistance had, if you want, as small as it was, but still within the broader balance. So yeah, that was pretty much it. So for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.